Welcome to the California Quest. This is Matt Plummer, and in today's debate, we are going to tackle the question, should California skip environmental reviews to boost housing production? So the California Environmental Quality Act, known as CEQA, and that's how we'll be referring to it from here on out, is often blamed for slowing and even blocking housing production. Well, new legislation that's being considered would allow localities to streamline and bypass some of that legislation and requirements when they are not meeting their housing goals. Is this the right step? Is this going to make a difference? Let's see. Let's jump in and explore this debate. So let's start with giving you some context. What is CEQA? CEQA is, again, the California Environmental Quality Act. It was signed into law in 1970, signed by Governor Reagan, Ronald Reagan. And basically, the goal of CEQA was to make developers, originally public, when it was public projects, so governmental projects, and now it's been expanded since then, but make developers consider the environmental impact of the development, and then, work to mitigate those impacts. And so that was the original purpose there. What happened was that CEQA required developers to create what's called an environmental impact report, an EIR, environmental impact report, when the estimated impact on the environment was considered or estimated to be significant. So when you do an EIR, you have to identify all the potential environmental impacts. So things that you would think about like air and water quality and habitat and wildlife, but also things like noise reduction, climate change related impact. So how many vehicle miles traveled, that's been a more recent addition. And so the developer must analyze this, and usually, it's not the developer themselves, but they must bring in a team to do this. So critics have argued that both the EIR process and litigation, which we'll talk about more, related to CEQA, has slowed down housing, has made it more difficult, more expensive, and blocked important housing development. The supporters of CEQA, though, on the other hand, would say that, CEQA has been critical to actually protecting the environment and promoting sustainable development. That takes us to about 5 years ago, September 2017, Governor Jerry Brown signs Senate Bill 35 into law. What did Senate Bill 35 do? It streamlined the approval of projects if a locality was not meeting its housing goals. So just a little background there. Each locality must submit a plan, a housing plan, to the state that says how many units of housing it plans to build over the next so many years. And the state then has to approve that. Well, if this locality is not meeting those goals and is on track to meet those goals, then Senate Bill 35 basically says they can streamline the approval related to CEQA. UC Berkeley's Turner Center for Housing and Innovation has estimated that over the last, roughly 4 to 5 years since Senate Bill 35 has been passed, that it has led to the approval of about 18,000 units. Okay, 18,000 units. Is that a lot? Is that a little bit? Over that time period, we estimate that that's about 3% of all housing units. So not nothing, but also not dramatic. Okay, so that takes us to where we are today. State Senator Scott Wiener has indicated that he's going to be proposing legislation that would cause Senate Bill 35 to be permanent. So back up a second, Senate Bill 35 is proposed to sunset in 2025. So in 2025, it will go away unless new legislation is enacted. And so Scott Wiener is proposing that we make that permanent. And here's what he says. California needs to deliver millions of homes in the coming years. We need to give cities and builders every tool to make those homes a reality. Let's remove that sunset and keep SB 35's success going. So that is our debate for today. Should California skip environmental reviews to boost housing? Let's look at the arguments for it and then the arguments against. A quick overview of our arguments here. The case for it, 3 main arguments. First, California is in dire need of more housing. Second, CEQA slows and even blocks housing production. And then third, CEQA makes housing more expensive. The case against. So this would be to say we should not streamline environmental reviews. First point here is CEQA ensures important protections for the environment. Kind of basic to start there. Number 2, local regulations are the primary deterrent of housing production, not CEQA. And number 3, CEQA has already been amended to minimize its impact on housing production. So let's jump in with number one. California is in dire need of more housing. So this is a pretty easy one to argue. So California has a huge housing shortage, and it's been decades in the making. A 2016 report by McKinsey & Company, a global consultancy, said that at that time, California would need to construct 3.5 million houses over essentially the next 9 years, so through 2025. So 3.5 million homes over that 9-year period. That's about 500,000 homes per year to meet this goal. So in 2017, shortly after this report came out, Gavin Newsom was running for governor and pledged to meet this goal, that California would build 3.5 million new units of housing by 2025. Well, how have we done? Not well. Short answer, not well. So last year we built 120,000 units. Remember, our goal should be around 500,000 units, so not that great. And we haven't exceeded 200,000 units since 2005. And this is from Cal Matters, in nearly 4 years since he took office, California cities are projected to have permitted a total of 452,000 homes, less than he pledged to build in 1 year alone. So permits do not equal building. Remember that. So we haven't even permitted 500,000 homes in 4 years when we were trying to build 5,000 homes in 1 year. And COVID obviously threw a wrench in this, and corresponding supply chain disruptions and the cost of lumber. So there was a number of other factors here that made this especially difficult to have done this in the last 4 years. But the point is that we are way behind on housing and we're not catching up. How does this compare to other states? Well, in 2016, California also ranked 49th out of 50 states in housing units per capita. New York, for example, on the other hand, built 80% more housing than California between 2009 and 2014. So almost twice as much housing there. This, as you can imagine, simple supply and demand, that our housing prices have gone way up, making it increasingly difficult for people to afford housing. Depending on when you look, the median home price in California is twice the national average, or right around there, and rents are among the highest in the country. So one analysis says virtually none of California's low-income and very low-income households can afford the local cost of housing. Nearly 70% of these households would have to spend more than half of their income to afford the local cost of housing. Half of their income is a lot more than we want. So usually they talk about affordability in housing of paying 30% of your income. So 70% would have to pay more than half. So California is in dire need of housing, and it's driving up the cost, the supply and demand situation there. Let's look at number two. Does CEQA slow and block housing production? And this is really the crux of the argument. If this is not true, then this kind of falls apart, right? So one of the ways that critics of CEQA would argue that it slows housing production is that it requires these really extensive environmental impact reports. And I just want to read this quote here from a study that was done and reported on in The Atlantic. It says, in the early days, initial studies in EIRs were generally quite short, covered only truly public projects. To minimize the risk of litigation today, EIRs have ballooned into 1,000-page documents covering potential impacts that few would normally associate with the environment. So the process of creating an EIR is really extensive today, not how it was when it first started. What does that mean in terms of approval time? The approval times, according to one study in Southern California, are very, very long. So between 2014 and 2016, the average time to approval, not to build, but to approval in Los Angeles was 13.1 months. Pasadena was over 16 months. And in Santa Monica, it was over 48 months, over 4 years just to get approval. And for projects, that isn't even the projects that require an EIR. That's all projects. And so projects that require an EIR is actually much longer, that ranging from 28 months, so almost 2.5 years, to 77 months, almost 6.5 years to get approval for a project. That is in these high density areas in Southern California. How does that equate to the whole state? Well, according to the California Legislative Analyst's Office, local agencies take, on average, 2.5 years to approve housing projects that require an EIR. 2.5 years. So not quite 77 months, but they're in the middle. And so obviously this is a long period of time. So even if we're trying to catch up at this rate, it's going to take us many years to even get to a place where we are, eating into that 3.5 million houses. The other thing that is potentially problematic about CEQA is that it allows any resident of California to anonymously file a lawsuit against a developer on the grounds of CEQA to block that. And so there's a question of, well, how often do lawsuits happen, and what are the impacts of these lawsuits? Well, a law firm, Holland & Knight, that works in the real estate and land use space has done studies on it. And obviously they have an interest in painting CEQA in a certain light, you could say. And so their 1-year snapshot of 2020 found that almost 50,000 housing units were challenged with anti-housing CEQA lawsuits, and thousands more were blocked, they say. So 50,000 units. Remember, last year we did 120,000 units, and so in 2020 that was even less. And so this is about half of the units. If we believe this study and believe these numbers, then about half of the units were challenged by lawsuits, which obviously slow it down and increase the expense. And the interesting thing is that one of their earlier reports from Holland & Knight in 2018 found that most of these lawsuits are actually against projects that are infill locations. What are infill locations? Infill locations are places where they have already been approved for a certain type of development, and yet a new developer comes. So say there's a lot that used to have a multifamily development on it. It was torn down for whatever reason, and a new developer wants to build a new one there. It's already been approved for that. That type of project should be the easiest to push through because the land has already been approved for that use. However, that is apparently, according to Holland & Knight's analysis, that's where most of these CEQA lawsuits are being cast against. What are some examples of this? So interestingly, and somewhat ironically, you could say, the most current example of this that has hit the news is that the state of California proposed a $1 billion project to create a new annex to its capital. And this would house governor's offices and his staff, and as well as legislators' offices. And that has been blocked by a lawsuit that argued that the state did not offer a reasonable range of alternatives. Back up about a year or two, and there's another high-profile CEQA-related lawsuit that blocked UC Berkeley from increasing its enrollment because it couldn't expand housing for its students. And so these are two high-profile examples. You can easily find a number of those. We don't want to draw too much from them, but it gives some sense of how CEQA can end up impacting development projects. Now that is really pushing the case that CEQA does slow and even block housing production. But there is data that paints a different story. So one study out of Golden Gate University Law School said that while CEQA-based delays make good headlines, the scope of CEQA problem may be smaller than it appears. For example, a study commissioned by the California Air Resources Board, CARB, found that less than 3% of approvals for housing projects face litigation. On average, there are fewer than 200 CEQA-related lawsuits per year in California, which puts the rate of CEQA-based litigation at 0.7% for all projects that undergo environmental review. So this is obviously painting a very different story than the data shared by Holland & Knight, and now they're doing it in slightly different ways. Remember, Holland & Knight was saying that 50,000 units were affected by CEQA lawsuits, whereas this is saying how many lawsuits were filed and saying that that was 200. And that, that equates to 0.7% of all projects requiring an EIR. Some different data here, presenting it in some slightly different ways. It's possible that it could be affecting a small number of projects, but a large number of units, which would kind of make sense that bigger projects would be more subject to lawsuits and opposition. And so this isn't the only data. There's also several studies dating back to 1991 that show similarly low litigation rates. And these, again, are focused on the number of lawsuits versus the number of proposed projects. So a survey of 46 California cities and counties found that only 6% of projects between 2015 and 2017 even required an EIR. And when EIRs are required, so the Association of Environmental Professionals suggests that on average it takes 15 months to get approval when you have to file an EIR versus the 28 to 77 months. So we have some different data here. And to be honest, we can see how the interest would align on each of these to present the findings in the way that they are and the analysis that they've done. So this is something that we're going to have to kind of continue to flesh out. It is a little challenging to really understand the methodology, particularly of Holland and Knight, who is, suggesting that these CEQA-related litigations are happening very commonly. It's also, if we look at a number of these studies that are showing that low litigation rates, the sample size is quite small. So in the example of the survey of California cities and counties, only 9% responded. So that was point number 2, argument number 2, the case for that CEQA slows and even blocks housing production. Let's move on to point number 3 in the case for. CEQA makes housing more expensive. So let me just quote Scott Wiener here, who is the proponent of extending Senate Bill 35. He says, however, the CEQA process is subject to appeals and lawsuits that can increase project costs and create delays for reasons completely unrelated to the environment. It's not unusual for it to take 3 to 4 years and millions of dollars to resolve a single lawsuit, while pre-lawsuit appeals regularly take 6 months to resolve. So there are 2 main ways that CEQA can increase the cost of developing housing. First is document preparation. And this is what we talked about in terms of the EIRs. That costs money. You have to hire a lead agency. You often have to hire different experts. And so you're paying money for that to be done. The second area is CEQA-related legal challenges, which we were just talking quite a bit about. And the important thing to know there is that a project developer will usually have to pay both its own legal bills and the tab of the lead agency, so the agency that was preparing the EIR. And what is more is that if the CEQA document is found to be deficient or in need of improvement, that often what happens is the developer also has to pay the legal fees of those who are challenging it. And so you can see that that can get quite expensive pretty quickly. One example that's unrelated to housing but can suggest how CEQA can impact costs actually has to do, maybe ironically, with wind farm construction. And so wind farm construction in California is 15 to 20% more expensive than it is in other parts of the country. There can be a number of different reasons for that, of course, but one of those has to do with CEQA and land use and permitting laws that are pretty onerous. And actually, wind farms are a common target for those who are using CEQA to oppose new development. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. So this presents the case that CEQA does increase the cost of development, which then is passed on to the people who buy the homes or who are leasing or renting those homes. However, like before in our point number 2, there are studies that suggest that the costs are not that significant. And so Environmental Justice Foundation, called the Rose Foundation, they did a study where they looked at several case studies, first 3 and then 5. And what they found is that the cost of preparing EIRs ranges from 0.025% to just 0.5% in terms of the total cost of development. And so that would suggest that these are not that significant. Now that is based on 8 case studies. We want to be thoughtful about how we draw conclusions based on information from 8 case studies. Okay, so that is the case for streamlining CEQA-related environmental reviews in order to boost housing production. Number 1, there's a dire need of housing in California. Number 2, CEQA slows and even blocks housing production. And number 3, CEQA increases the cost of housing. Okay, let's jump into the case against streamlining environmental reviews in order to boost housing production. And we will walk through 3 different arguments that go against moving forward with Senator Scott Wiener's plan to, basically not allow this Senate Bill 35 to sunset. So the first one, as you would probably expect, is that CEQA ensures important protections for the environment. And if we look at some of those high-profile examples that we shared earlier, the State Capitol Annex project and the UC Berkeley expansion that was thwarted by CEQA, we've seen that those who are using CEQA to stop and block these projects are citing environmental reasons. So, for example, here's a lawyer who worked to block the Capitol Annex project. He said, "The court sided with the people of California today I hope state officials will properly consider alternatives to the project which do not involve decimating these irreplaceable historical resources. Those who are arguing for the pause on increased enrollment at UC Berkeley said something similar. They said, the university's proposal would have destroyed a landmark on the National Register of Historic Places in one of the most underparked areas in the nation. So they are citing environmental reasons there. If we go to statements by the Rose Foundation, which is the environmental justice foundation that we have cited earlier, they would argue that CEQA is achieving its purpose of protecting the environment. Here's what they say. Over time, CEQA has proved extraordinarily effective in protecting California's environment, including minimizing air, water, soil, and noise pollution that harms public health, while giving community members a powerful voice in the land use process. Okay, so it's hard to actually quantify or measure the amount of environment or the length or extent to which CEQA has protected the environment, but those who are on the side of CEQA would argue that it is doing its job in that respect. However, there are critics that argue the opposite, that recently, in the last decade or so, that CEQA has actually been used to undermine environmental and specifically climate progress. A study by Pepperdine, this is what they say. Unsurprisingly, given the convoluted way in which CEQA litigation is being used today, a recent study shows that CEQA lawsuits are actually worsening the very thing that CEQA was made to protect, the environment. And they go on to say that it's evolved into a legal tool that's used basically by NIMBY residents. What are NIMBY residents? Not in my backyard. So people who do not want new developments, they do not want higher density developments. And so the tool has become a weapon for those to prevent any form of development. UC Davis professor Chris Elmendorf, who, as far as I can tell, is a big proponent of climate action. He says the same thing, and he explains it really well. He says that basically CEQA puts a heavy thumb on the scale in the favor of maintaining the status quo. If anyone musters a fair argument that any physical change, those quotes are his, any physical change that a project might cause would have any locally adverse effect, then the project can't proceed unless a sponsor undertakes an exhaustive study and mitigates all physical effects found to be, quote unquote, significant. Now, here's a really good line by him. He says, the paradigm would make sense if humankind inhabited an ecological Eden in which everything was perfect until we touched it. But the world we live in today requires substantial physical changes to remain habitable. So what he's saying is that CEQA essentially works to maintain the status quo, whatever that is, and that if that status quo is good for the environment, then sure, it protects the environment. But if that status quo cuts against the environment and it needs to be updated in order to improve the environment or to accommodate climate change, then it actually is cutting against the very intent that it was designed to create. The law firm Holland Knight, which we've talked quite a bit about, it actually goes further to say that those who are filing CEQA lawsuits actually aren't even environmental advocates. According to their study, and again, it's hard to know the rigor behind these allegations or claims, I should say, but they say 64% of those filing CEQA lawsuits are individuals or local associations, and the vast majority of them have no prior track record of environmental advocacy. So certainly some of this work that's being pushed forward by CEQA is protecting the environment and being done by people with the intent of protecting the environment. Could it be that either intentionally in the case of the NIMBY residents or unintentionally in case of those who are using it to maintain status quo, that it's actually being used to undermine environmental progress? It appears that that is certainly possible. Okay, let's move on to case number 2 against streamlining CEQA and environmental reviews in order to boost housing production. And this is a really important one. This one says that local regulations are the primary deterrents of housing production, not CEQA. So here again, as I said in the beginning, if CEQA is not actually the problem causing housing slowdowns and housing production slowdowns and construction, and it's actually other things, then we shouldn't be focused on reforming CEQA in order to drive housing production. So here, as you would imagine, when it comes to housing, there are a wide variety of causes of the current shortage that we're facing. And research usually points to multiple factors, not just CEQA or not just any one factor. However, if we look at research by the Hoover Institute, they emphasize one of the factors above the others. They say that the substantial rise in California home prices, which is linked to a shortage since the 1980s, coincides with more restrictive land use regulations, including tighter zoning regulations. Many studies present evidence that these regulations are substantially increasing housing costs. In fact, several economists actually say that if we were just to reverse and bring back land use regulations to where they were in 2000, that housing production would explode and we'd be able to dramatically increase our housing production. So they're saying that it's actually land use and zoning regulations that are being decided on and implemented at the local level. Another study here says that all data points to local authority over land and local regulation as the most significant barrier to increasing infill dense housing and affordable housing. So here again, we see that the data when it comes to what exactly is the primary cause of our housing shortage, it's being pointed more towards local decisions around how they regulate their land. So how exactly are localities slowing down housing production? Well, a study by UC Berkeley found that localities get to decide when they require a discretionary review process versus just a streamlined expedited review for a new development. And here's what's interesting. If they require a discretionary review, then that triggers CEQA and requires CEQA-related reviews. And what we found is that in a lot of localities, this research by UC Berkeley has found that they're requiring discretionary reviews for housing units and development projects of 5 or more units. And so many of the units, especially any of the bigger ones, are requiring a discretionary review process, which then triggers a CEQA review process. We also can see that different localities take wildly different times to process environmental impact reports. And so there is something at the local level that is driving this variation versus a statewide or a top-down legislation that's causing the delays. Not to say that that's not causing a base level delay, but that there are some things that are different that each locality is doing that could either speed it up or slow it down. And so there again, a lot of this is being decided and impacted at the local level in terms of how they're actually deciding to implement these regulations. Okay, so we're kind of blaming localities, cities and counties. What do they say when it comes to why we have a housing shortage? Well, they also do not blame CEQA as the primary cause of the housing shortage. They don't blame themselves either, which you would expect. So what they say is they blame it on high development costs, neighborhood opposition, which could be linked to CEQA, as we've talked about, lack of sites, and lack of affordable housing funding. So either way, regardless of who you're looking at here, there are many people and a lot of research that is actually pointing to local land use regulations and zoning laws and the implementation of those laws and the variation in how localities do it as the primary cause of the housing shortage versus CEQA specifically, or at least the construction of CEQA at the state level. All right, let's move on to case number 3 against the argument for streamlining environmental reviews. And this is the argument that CEQA has already been amended to minimize its impact on housing production. And so the argument goes here that, okay, we've already, stripped it down, made relevant exceptions in order to allow housing to move forward in ways that would have minimal or insignificant impact on the environment, and that it's only currently in its current form, it's only really designed to stop the most egregious examples of environmental impact. And so there's 2 ways to kind of look at this. One is how many exceptions actually exist on the law books, and then also how often are these exceptions used. Well, when it comes to exceptions, there are a fair number of exceptions. The one thing to note, though, is that many of them are scheduled to sunset in the next several years. And so they have had a temporary life cycle, but they aren't necessarily permanent exceptions. The second question of how often are these exceptions used, the answer there is clearly very commonly. And so as we've cited a variety of different data in terms of how often are environmental impact reports used, there again the data varies, but it's a relatively small number. And so many of these other exceptions that are less intensive are being used on a regular basis. So there are a fair number of exceptions. Now, those could go away, and they are being used a lot. A study by UC Berkeley warns that if we further strip CEQA, it actually could eliminate its usefulness. And so they say misguided CEQA reform could undermine environmental protection throughout the state without providing meaningful improvements to our housing situation. And that would be the risk, that we strip CEQA, that it no longer has any teeth to do what it was intended to do, and it also doesn't change our housing shortage. So those are the three arguments against streamlining environmental reviews. We have the first one, that it's important because it provides protections for the environment. Second, that it's actually not CEQA's fault that we have a housing shortage, that it's local land use regulations. And then third, we've actually already amended CEQA such that we've minimized its impact on housing and are just leaving it to do the most good for the environment. Okay, so those are both sides of the debate in terms of, should we further strip CEQA in order to boost housing production, or should we keep CEQA where it is, keep the environmental review process where it is? I would love to hear your thoughts on this debate. What do you think is more important? Which is a greater priority for California right now? Is there data or research that you've seen that I have missed, that I haven't included here, that you think would help frame or reorient or change the nature of this debate? Are there key points being made by either side that haven't been made here? I would love to hear from you in the comments here, or send me an email at matt@thecaliforniaquest.com. So let me know what you are thinking, where this leaves you, what else needs to be included in this debate. I will now share my assessment of the scenario. So let's start with what I think pretty much everyone could agree is true, and that is that we do have a dire housing shortage in California, and that its impact is significant and severe. And so I quoted that 2016 McKinsey study earlier, and what they say in that study is that we lose 6% of the state's GDP each year because of this housing shortage. Now add on to the fact that we are seeing more than 100,000 people leave the state in net migration out of the state over the last 3 years, each of the last 3 years. And we are seeing our state budget move from record surpluses to a deficit now. And so I would say those three factors of a severe housing shortage combined with net migration out of the state, combined with a state budget, suggests to me that we need to take action on this quickly, and we need to take pretty significant action. Now, is CEQA limiting CEQA the right action to take? Well, there I would say my assessment of the data on either side is that it's inconclusive, but there seems to be more data and a greater diversity of data that suggests that CEQA has a more minimal effect on housing production overall, on both the speed at which housing is produced and the cost of housing in terms of the cost incurred through documentation preparation and through lawsuits. I'm not saying that that is conclusive. I'm just saying the state of the data really it leans towards CEQA being minimal in terms of its robustness and in terms of the amount and variation of data. On the side that's basically saying that's significant, we really have one law firm that has put forth data on that. And so that's hard to know. It also seems pretty clear that local land use regulations and zoning laws are a significant part of the problem and should be a focus of reform. So even if we do say that CEQA is part of the problem, we should definitely not point to CEQA and CEQA reform as the silver bullet to fixing our housing problems, because there's certainly something going on at the local level that is really having an effect on it. That said, the housing shortage is significant, and if SB 35 is having even a minimal impact, 3% of housing, and helping streamline 3% of housing units over the last several years, then that at this point seems worth continuing, but not necessarily making permanent. There could be a time where this shifts, where the housing shortage is no longer significant, where environmental protection needs to be the priority. And so what I would recommend is that we actually continue SB 35 for another 10 years, and then at that point see what progress have we made on the housing shortage does the balance tip in a different way in terms of housing versus environment, and who is using the housing? And hopefully get some better data in terms of how often are lawsuits happening, what are the true costs imposed, not on 8 case studies, which is what we really have today, but on a broader sample, and be able to determine more conclusively the impact of CEQA on housing production. So that is my assessment. Let's extend it another 10 years, SB 35, extend it another 10 years, and then reevaluate it in 8 to 9 years to understand where do we stand today and do we need to make a change. Thank you for joining me for this debate on the California Quest. Please subscribe or follow us on whatever platform you're listening to this on, and drop us a comment to let us know how you're thinking about this debate.